Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 37, Jarndyce and Jarndyce. If the secret I had to keep had been mine, I must have confided it to Ada before we had been long together, but it was not mine. And I did not feel that I had a right to tell it, even to my guardian, unless some great emergency arose. It was a weight to bear alone. Still, my present duty appeared to be plain, and blessed in the attachment of my dear. I did not want an impulse and encouragement to do it, though often when she was asleep and all was quiet, the remembrance of my mother kept me waking, and made the night sorrowful. I did not yield to it at another time, and Ada found me what I used to be, except, of course, in that particular of which I have said enough, and which I have no intention of mentioning any more just now, if I can help it. The difficulty that I felt in being quite composed that first evening when Ada asked me over our work if the family were at the house, and when I was obliged to answer yes, I believed so, for Lady Dedlock had spoken to me in the woods the day before yesterday, was greater still when Ada asked me what she had said, and when I replied that she had been kind and interested, and when Ada, while admitting her beauty and elegance, remarked upon her proud manner and her imperious, chilling air. But Charlie helped me through unconsciously by telling us that Lady Dedlock had only stayed at the house 2 nights on her way from London to visit some other great house in the next county, and that she had left early on the morning after we had seen her at our view, as we called it. Charlie verified the adage about little pictures, I am sure, for she heard of more sayings and doings in a day than would have come to my ears in a month. We were to stay at Mr. Boythorn's. My pet had scarcely been there a week, as I recollect the time, when one evening, just as the candles were lighted, Charlie, appearing with a very important air behind Ada's chair, beckoned me mysteriously out of the room. "If you please, miss," said Charlie in a whisper, "you're wanted at the Dedlock Arms." "Why, Charlie," said I, "who can possibly want me at the public house?" "I don't know, miss," returned Charlie, "but it's a gentleman, miss, and his compliments, and will you please to come without saying anything about it?" "Whose compliments, Charlie?" "His and miss," returned Charlie, whose grammatical education was advancing, but not very rapidly. "How do you come to be the messenger, Charlie?" "I am not the messenger, if you please, miss," returned my little maid. "It was W. Grubble, miss." "I, the landlord, Charlie?" "Yes, miss, if you please, miss." Not knowing what might be the matter, and being easily apprehensive now, I thought it best to go to this place by myself. I bade Charlie be quick with my bonnet and veil and shawl, and having put them on, went away down the little hilly street, where I was as much at home as in Mr. Boythorn's garden. Mr. Grubble was standing in his shirt-sleeves at the door of his very clean little tavern, waiting for me. He lifted off his hat with both hands when he saw me coming, and carrying it so, as if it were an iron vessel, it looked as heavy, preceded me along the sanded passage to his best parlor, a neat carpeted room, with more plants in it than were quite convenient, a colored print of Queen Caroline, several shells, a good many tea trays, 2 stuffed and dried fish in glass cases, and either a curious egg or a curious pumpkin, but I don't know which, I doubt if many people did, hanging from the ceiling. I knew Mr. Grubble very well by sight, from his often standing at his door, a pleasant-looking, stoutish, middle-aged man, who never seemed to consider himself cosily dressed, cozily dressed, for his own fireside, without his hat and top boots, but who never wore a coat except at church. He snuffed the candle, and backing away a little to see how it looked, backed out of the room. The door of the opposite parlor being open, I heard some voices familiar to my ears, I thought. A quick, light step approached the room in which I was, and who should stand before me but Richard. "My dear Esther," he said, "my best friend." And he really was so warm-hearted and earnest in that fine surprise and pleasure of his brotherly greeting, I could scarcely find breath to tell him that Ada was well. "Answering my very thoughts, always the same, dear girl," said Richard, leading me to a chair and seating himself beside me. I put my veil up, but not quite. "Always the same, dear girl," said Richard, just as heartily as before. I put up my veil altogether, and laying my hand on Richard's sleeve and looking in his face, told him how much I thanked him for his kind welcome, and how greatly I rejoiced to see him, the more so because the determination I had made in my illness, which I now conveyed in him. "My love," said Richard, "there is no one with whom I have a greater wish to talk than you, for I want you to understand me." "And I want you, Richard," said I, shaking my head, "to understand someone else." "Since you refer so immediately to John Jarndyce," said Richard, "I suppose you mean him?" "Of course I do." "Then I may say at once I am glad of it, because it is on that subject that I am anxious to be understood. By you, mind you, my dear, I am not accountable to Mr. Jarndyce, or to Mr. Anybody." I was pained to find him taking this tone, and he observed it. "Well, well, my dear," said Richard, "we won't go into that now. I want to appear quietly in your country house here, with you under my arm, and give my charming cousin a surprise. I suppose your loyalty to John Jarndyce will allow that." "My dear Richard," I returned, "you know you would be heartily welcomed at his house, your home, if you will but consider it so, and you are as heartily welcome here." "Spoken like the best of little women," cried Richard gaily. I asked him how he liked his profession. "Oh, I like it well enough," said Richard. "It's all right. It does as well as anything else for a time. I don't know that I shall care about it when I come to be settled, but I can sell out then, and, however, never mind all that botheration at present." So young and handsome, and in all respects so perfectly the opposite of Miss Flight, and yet, in the clouded, eager, seeking look that passed over him, so dreadfully like her. "I am in town on leave just now," said Richard. "I have run over to look after my chancery interests before the long vacation," said Richard, forcing a careless laugh. "Ha, ha, ha. We are beginning to spin along with that old suit at last, I promise you." No wonder that I shook my head. "As you say, it's not a pleasant subject." Richard spoke with the same shade crossing his face as before. "Let it go to the four winds tonight. Puff, gone." I walked softly with Richard, and said, "Ada, my love, I have brought a gentleman to visit you." It was not difficult to read the blushing, startled face. She loved him dearly, and he knew it, and I knew it. It was a very transparent business, that meeting as cousins only. I almost mistrusted myself as growing quite wicked in my suspicions, but I was not so sure that Richard loved her dearly. He admired her very much. Anyone must have done that, and, I dare say, would have renewed their youthful engagement with great pride and ardor, but that he knew how she would respect his promise to my guardian. Still, I had a tormenting idea that the influence upon him extended even here, that he was postponing his best truth and earnestness, and in this, as in all things, until Jarndyce should be off his mind. Ah me, what Richard would have been without that blight I never shall now know. He told Ada in his most ingenious way that he had not come to make any secret inroad on terms she had accepted, rather too implicitly and confidingly, he thought, from Mr. Jarndyce, that he had come openly to see her and to see me, and to justify himself for the present terms on which he stood with Mr. Jarndyce. He begged that I would make an appointment for the morning, when he might set himself right, through the means of an unreserved conversation with me. I proposed to walk with him in the park at 7 o'clock, and this was arranged. Richard was a little late, but I had not to wait for him long, and we turned into the park. The air was bright and dewy, and the sky without a cloud. "This is a lovely place," said Richard, looking round. "None of the jar and discord of lawsuits here." But there was other trouble. "I tell you what, my dear girl," said Richard, "when I get affairs in general settled, I shall come down here, I think, and rest." "Would it not be better to rest now?" I asked. "Oh, as to resting now," said Richard, "or as to doing anything very definite now, that's not easy. In short, it can't be done. I can't do it, at least." "Why not?" said I. "You know why. Esther, if you were living in an unfinished house, liable to have the roof put on or taken off tomorrow, next day, next week, next month, next year, you would find it hard to rest and settle. So do I. Now, there's no now for us suitors." "My dear Richard," said I, "this is a bad beginning of our conversation." I knew you would tell me so, Dame Durden." "And I am not alone, dear Richard. It was not I who cautioned you once never to found hope or exception on the family curse. There you come back to John Jarndyce, said Richard impatiently. Well, we must approach him sooner or later, for he is the staple of what I have to say, and it's as well at once. My dear Esther, how can you be so blind? Don't you see that he is an interested party, and that it may be very well for him to wish me to know nothing of the suit and care nothing about it, but that it may not be quite so well for me? Oh, Richard, I remonstrated, is it possible that you can ever have seen him and heard him, that you can ever have lived under his roof and known him, and can yet breathe such unworthy suspicions? He reddened deeply, as if his natural generosity felt a pang of reproach. He was silent for a little while before he replied with a subdued voice, Esther, I am sure you know that I am not a mean fellow, and that I have some sense of suspicion and distrust, being poor qualities in one of my years. I know it very well, said I. I am not more sure of anything. There's a dear girl, retorted Richard, and like you, because it gives me comfort, I had need to get some scrape of comfort out of all this business, for it's a bad one at the best, as I have no occasion to tell you. I know, said I know as well, Richard. What shall I say? As well as I do that such misconstructions are foreign to your nature, and I know, as well as you do, what so changes it. Come, sister, come, said Richard a little more gaily. You will be fair with me, at all events. If I have the misfortune to be under that influence, so has he. If it has a little twisted me, it may have a little twisted him too. I don't say that he is not an honourable man, I am sure he is, but it taints everybody. You have heard him say so 50 times. Then why should he escape? Because, said I, he is an uncommon character, and he has resolutely kept himself outside the circle, Richard. Oh, because, replied Richard, in his vivacious way. I am not sure, my dear girl, but that it may be wise and specious to preserve that outward indifference. It may cause other parties interested to become lax about their interests, and people may die off, and points may drag themselves out of memory, and many things may soothingly happen that are convenient enough. I was so touched with pity for Richard that I could not reproach him any more, even by a look. I remembered my guardian's gentleness toward his errors, and with what perfect freedom from resentment he had spoken of them. Esther, Richard resumed, you are not to suppose that I have come here to make underhand charges against John Jarndyce. I have only come to justify myself. What I say is, it was all very well, and we got on well while I was a boy, utterly regardless of this same suit. But as soon as I began to take an interest in it and look into it, then it was quite another thing. Then John Jarndyce discovers that Ada and I must break off, and that I don't amend that very objectionable course. I am not fit for her. Now, Esther, I don't mean to amend that very objectionable course. I will not hold John Jarndyce's favour on those unfair terms of compromise, which he had no right to dictate. Whether it pleases him or displeases him, I must maintain my rights and Ada's. I have been thinking about it a good deal, and this is the conclusion I have come to. Poor dear Richard. He had indeed been thinking about it a good deal. His face, his voice, his manner all showed that too plainly. So I tell him honestly, you are to know I have written to him about all this, that we are at issue, and that we had better be at issue openly than covertly. I thank him for his goodwill and his protection, and he goes his road and I go mine. The fact is, our roads are not the same. Under one of the wills in dispute, I should take much more than he. I don't mean to say that it is the one to be established, but there it is, and it has its chance. I have naught to learn from you, my dear Richard, said I. Of your letter I have heard of it already without an offended or angry word. Indeed, replied Richard, softening, I am glad. I said he was an honourable man out of all this wretched affair. But I always say that, and I have never doubted it. Now, my dear Esther, I know these views of mine appear extremely harsh to you, and will to Ada when you tell her what has passed between us. But if you had gone into the case as I have, if you had only applied yourself to the papers as I did when I was at Kenge's, if you only knew what an accumulation of charges and countercharges and suspicions and cross-suspicions they involve, you would think me moderate in comparison. Perhaps so, said I, but I do think that among those many papers there is much truth and justice, Richard. But do you think that among those many papers there is much truth and justice, Richard? There is truth and justice somewhere in the case, Esther. Or was once, long ago, said I. Must be somewhere, pursued Richard impetuously, and must be brought out. To allow Ada to be made a bribe and hush money is not the way to bring it out. You say the suit is changing me. John Jarndyce says it changes, has changed, and will change everybody who has any share of it. Then the greater right I have on my side when I resolve to do all I can to bring it to an end. All you can, Richard? Do you think that in these many years no others have done all they could? Has the difficulty grown easier because of so many failures? It can't last forever, returned Richard with his fierceness, this kindling in him, which again presented to me that last sad reminder. I am young and earnest, and energy and determination have done wonders many a time. Others have only thrown themselves into it. I devote myself to it. I make it the object of my life. Oh, Richard, my dear, so much the worse, so much the worse. No. Don't you be afraid for me, he returned affectionately. You're a dear, good, wise, quiet, blessed girl. But you have your prepossessions. So I come round to John Jarndyce. I tell you, my good Esther, when he and I were on those terms which he found so convenient, we were not on natural terms. Are division and animosity your natural terms, Richard? No, I don't say that. I mean that all this business puts us on unnatural terms. See another reason for urging it on. I may find out when it's over that I have been mistaken in John Jarndyce. My head may be clearer when I am free of it, and I may then agree with what you say today. Very well. Then I shall acknowledge it and make him reparation. Everything postponed in that imaginary time. Everything held in confusion and indecision until then. Now, my best in confidants, said Richard, I want my cousin Ada to understand that I am not capricious, fickle, and wilful about John Jarndyce, but that I have this purpose and reason at my back. I wish to represent myself to her through you, because she has a great esteem and respect for her cousin John, and I know you will soften the course I take, even though you disapprove of it. And in short, said Richard, who had been hesitating through these words, I don't like to represent myself in this contentious, doubting character to a confiding girl like Ada. I told him that he was more like himself in those letters than in anything he had said yet. Why, acknowledged Richard, that may be true enough, my love. I rather feel it to be so, but I shall be able to give myself fair play by and by. I shall come all right again. Then don't you be afraid. I asked him if this were all he wished me to tell Ada. Not quite, said Richard. I am bound not to withhold from her that John Jarndyce answered my letter in his usual manner, addressing me as my dear Rick, trying to argue me out of my opinions, and telling me that they should make no difference to him. I also want Ada to know that if I see her seldom just now, I am looking after her interests as well as my own, we two being in the same boat exactly, and that I hope she will not suppose, from any flying rumours she may hear, that I am at all light-headed or imprudent. On the contrary, I am always looking forward to the termination of the suit, and always planning in that direction. Being of age now, and having taken the step I have taken, I consider myself free from any accountability to John Jarndyce. But Ada, being still a ward of the court, I don't yet ask her to renew our engagement. When she is free to act for herself, I shall be myself once more, and we shall both be in very different worldly circumstances, I believe. If you tell her all this, with the advantage of your of your considerate way, you will do me a very great and a very kind service, my dear Esther, and I shall knock Jarndyce and Jarndyce on the head with greater vigour. Of course I ask for no secrecy at Bleak House." "Richard," said I, "you place great confidence in me, but I fear you will not take advice from me." "It's impossible that I can on this subject, my dear girl. On any other, readily. As if there were any other in his life. "But may I ask you a question, Richard?" "I think so," he said laughingly. "I don't know who may not, if you may not. You say yourself that you are not leading a very settled life." "How can I, my dear Esther, with nothing settled?" "Are you in debt again?" "Why, of course I am," said Richard, astonished at my simplicity. "Is it of course?" "My dear child, certainly. I can't throw myself into an object so completely without expense. You forget, or perhaps you don't know, that under either of the wills, Ada and I take something. It's only a question between the larger sum and the smaller. I shall be within the mark anyway. Bless your heart, my excellent girl," said Richard, quite amused with me. "I shall be all right. I shall pull through, my dear." I felt so deeply sensible of the danger in which he stood that I tried in Ada's name and my guardian's and my own, by every fervent means that I could think of, to warn him of it and show him some of his mistakes. He received everything I said with patience and gentleness, but it all rebounded from him without taking the least effect. I could not wonder at this. After the reception his preoccupied mind had given to my guardian's letter, but I determined to try Ada's influence yet. So when our walk brought us round to the village again, I went home to breakfast. I prepared Ada for the account I was going to give her, and told her exactly what reason we had to dread that Richard was losing himself and scattering his whole life to the winds. It made her very unhappy, of course, though she had a far, far greater reliance on his correcting his errors than I could have. She presently wrote him this little letter. "My dearest cousin, Esther has told me all you have said to her this morning. I write this to repeat most earnestly for myself all that she said to you, and let you know how sure I am that you will sooner or later find our cousin John a pattern of truth, sincerity, and goodness, when you will deeply, deeply grieve to have done him, without intending it, so much wrong. I do not quite know how to write what I wish to say next, but I trust you will understand it is as I mean it. I have some fears, my dearest cousin, that it may be partly for my sake. You are now laying up so much unhappiness for yourself, and if for yourself, for me, in case this should be so, or in case you should entertain much thought of me in what you are doing, I most earnestly entreat and beg you to desist. You can do nothing for my sake that will make me half as happy as for ever turning your back upon the shadow in which we both were born. Do not be angry with me for saying this. Pray, pray, dear Richard, for my sake, and for your own, and in a natural repugnance for that source of trouble which had its share in making us both orphans when we were very young. Pray, pray, let it go forever. We have reason to know by this time that there is no good in it, and no hope, and there is nothing to be got from it now but sorrow. My dearest cousin, it is needless for me to say that you are quite free, and that it is very likely you may find someone whom you will love much better than your first fancy. I am quite sure, if you will let me say so, that the object of your choice would greatly prefer to follow your fortunes far and wide, however moderate or poor, and see you happy, doing your duty and pursuing your chosen way, than to have the hope of being, or even to be, very rich with you, at the cost of dragging years of procrastination and anxiety, and of your indifference to other aims. You may wonder at my saying this so confidently, with so little knowledge or experience, but I know it for a certainty from my own heart. Ever, my dearest cousin, your most affectionate Ada. This note brought Richard to us very soon, but it made little change in him, if any. We would fairly try, he said, who was right and who was wrong. He would show us, we would see. He was animated and glowing, as if Ada's tenderness had gratified him, but I could only hope that the letter might have stronger effect upon his mind on reperusal than it assuredly had then. I felt a relief when Richard, with an exclamation of surprise, hurried away to meet a stranger whom he first descried coming slowly toward us, and coming back to us in an excited state, presented Mr. Vholes, a sallow man with pinched lips that looked as if they were cold, a red eruption here and there upon his face, tall and thin, about 50 years of age, high-shouldered and stooping, dressed in black-gloved and buttoned up to the chin. "I hope I don't disturb you, ladies," said Mr. Vholes. And now I observed that he was further remarkable for an inward manner of speaking. "I arranged with Mr. Carstone that he should always know when his cause was with the Chancellor's paper, and being informed by one of my clerks last night, after the post time, that it had stood in the paper. For tomorrow I put myself into the coach early this morning and came down to confer with him." "Yes," said Richard, flushed and looking triumphantly at Ada and me. "We don't do these things in the old slow way now. We spin along now. Mr. Vholes, we must hire something to get over to the post town in and catch the mail tonight, and go up by it." "Anything you please, sir," returned Mr. Vholes. "I am quite at your service." "Let me see," said Richard, looking at his watch. "If I run down in the deadlock and get my portmanteau fastened up, and order a gig or a chaise or whatever's to be got, we shall have an hour then before starting. I'll come back to tea, Cousin Ada. Will you and Esther take care of Mr. Vholes while I am gone?" He was away directly, in his heat and hurry, and was soon lost in the dusk of evening. We, who were left, walked on toward the house. "Is Mr. Carstone's presence necessary tomorrow, sir?" said I. "Can it do any good?" "No, miss," Mr. Vholes replied. "I am not aware that it can. Mr. Carstone has laid down the principle of watching his own interests, and when a client lays down his own principle, and it is not immoral, it devolves upon me to carry it out. I wish in business to be exact and open. I am a widower with 3 daughters, Emma, Jane, and Caroline, and my desire is to discharge the duties of life as to leave them a good name. This appears to be a pleasant spot, miss." This remark being made to me, in consequence of my being next to him as we walked, I assented and enumerated its chief attractions. "Indeed," said Mr. Vholes, "I have had the privilege of supporting an aged father in the Vale of Taunton, his native place, and I also admire that country very much. I had no idea there was anything so attractive here." To keep up the conversation, I asked Mr. Vholes if he would like to live altogether in the country. "There, miss," said he, "you touch me in a tender stream. My health is not good, my digestion being much impaired, and if I had only myself to consider, I should take refuge in rural habits, especially as the cares of business have prevented me from ever coming much into the care and contact with general society, and particularly with ladies' society, which I have most wished to mix in. But with my 3 daughters, Emma, Jane, and Caroline, and my aged father, I cannot afford to be selfish." It required some attention to hear him, on account of his inward speaking and his lifeless manner. We now arrived at Mr. Boythorn's house, where the tea-table, all prepared, was awaiting us. Richard came in, restless, and hurried shortly afterward. and, leaning over Mr. Vholes's chair, whispered something in his ear. Mr. Vholes replied aloud, or as nearly aloud as I suppose he had ever replied to anything. "You would drive me with you, sir. It is all the same to me, sir. Anything you please. I am quite at your service." Richard's high spirits carrying everything before them, we all went out together to the top of the hill above the village, where we had ordered a gig to wait. I never shall forget those two seated side by side in the lantern's light, Richard all flush and fire and laughter, with the reins in his hand, Mr. Vholes quite still, black-gloved and buttoned up, looking at him as if he were looking at his prey and charming it. And that is the end of chapter 37.